Welcome to the Yale Center for British Arts Online at Home series. My name is Michael Crosby. I'm a professor of architecture at the University of Hartford, and I'm delighted to participate in this program today with Marisa Angell Brown, Assistant Director for Programs at the John Nicholas Brown Center for Public Humanities and Cultural Heritage at Brown University. Marisa's lecture today is called Model City. Before we get started with the lecture, I have a few housekeeping notes to share. Please note that this program will be recorded and your camera and sound are muted and will remain so throughout the program. We will be using the Q&A feature located on your navigation bar, that's at the very bottom, over to the right, to gather your questions for Marisa, and they will be answered at the end of the program. Now, I want to tell you a little bit about our speaker today. Marisa Angell Brown is a cultural historian and curator with interests in architecture, preservation, public art, and spatial justice. She delivered the keynote address, Inheritance, What We Preserve and Why, at the January 2020 annual meeting of the Providence Preservation Society, and is the author of Preservation's Expanded Field, published by Routledge Press in 2020. Her writing has appeared in the Providence Journal, Art New England, Perspecta, and the Journal of the Society of Architectural Historians, and her exhibitions and installations have been covered by Metropolis, Architectural Record, and the National Trust for Historic Preservation and the Rhode Island Public Radio programs. Brown is Assistant Director of the John Nicholas Brown Center for Public Humanities and Cultural Heritage at Brown University, and a lecturer in the Department of American Studies at Brown. She has a PhD in the history of art from Yale University, an MA in history from the University of Chicago, and an AB in religion from Princeton University. She's currently serving on the executive committee of the Association of Cultural Heritage Studies, the State Review Board for the Rhode Island State Historic Preservation Office, and on the board of the Rhode Island State House Restoration Society. Please join me now in welcoming Marisa.
Thanks, Mike. That is such a nice introduction, and it's also such a pleasure because I've been such a fan of Michael's writing and his architectural criticism for a really, really long time. No one, I think, knows New Haven architecture and broadly what's happening in Connecticut and also the region and nationally as well as Michael does. And so it's a lot of fun to have him here, and I'm looking forward to our conversation after the lecture. I wanted to thank you too. Thanks to the Yale Center for British Art for the invitation. As you know, I got my PhD at Yale, and so it's always fun to be back at Yale, even if it's just on Zoom and not actually back in New Haven. So unfortunately, we are on Zoom, but fortunately that does allow more people, hopefully, to tune in and hear a little bit about New Haven architecture, which is what I'm going to talk about today. And if anyone knows, if we were all together in the lecture room, I would probably ask people to raise their hand if they recognize where actually this picture of myself was taken, which is at the Glass House, a little ways from New Haven. So, Model City. I thought I would start with a slide of the British Art Center so that we can pretend that we are sitting in the wonderful auditorium of the British Art Center together. It's been a few years since I've been there. Today in Providence, which is where I am right now, is a sort of a gray but bright day, and so it looks like that in the slide as well. So let's all sort of pretend that we are in the same space together, and as we enter into thinking about some of the buildings I'm going to talk about in New Haven. Let me just go back one quick second. I can't exactly see who's here, but I did want to recognize a couple of people. Before I begin, I wanted to recognize Jane Nowo-Sadko, the head of public programs, for setting this up. Of course, Mike for moderating and for the conversation that follows. I also wanted to say hello, if she's here, to Linda Friedlander, the head of education, because we go back a long way, and I've always found the work that she does to be inspiring and sort of leading edge in the field of museum education and engagement. And of course, Courtney Martin, the director of the British Art Center, who is a creative, brilliant, and decisive leader and scholar. And I look forward to seeing how the British Art Center continues to blossom through her scholarship and leadership. So actually, before we get to the next slide, I did want to tell you a little bit about how I approach some of this material. So as you heard, I'm at probably an institution that has the longest name possible, the John Nicholas Brown Center for Public Humanities and Cultural Heritage. It's a 2-year master's program in the public humanities at Brown University. And it's sort of a mix of museum studies, public history, heritage and preservation, along with research and thinking about the management of cultural institutions. It's a really dynamic place to be as we really think about that common ground where the humanities, non-academic communities, and the most pressing questions of the day come together. It was the first graduate program in the public humanities, and we continue to think a lot about the ways in which history and the arts are or have been deployed to support systems of power and privilege, and conversely, how they can be used to challenge these systems, create new knowledge, objects, or landscapes that tell a more accurate and democratic story about the past and the present. So these are some of the things that I've always been interested in. I was really interested in when I was at Yale doing my PhD, and that continue to interest and challenge me where I am today. So a lot of my work ranges across public art, monuments, architecture, spatial justice, which we'll talk about in this presentation, and systems of preservation and heritage, why we preserve certain things, what we preserve, and who gets to decide. And sort of along with that, I'm interested in histories of demolished sites, things we choose not to preserve, lost communities, and also in new work that artists are doing at historic sites that challenge accepted ideas about the past. So, New Haven. Today I'm going to share some thoughts and reflections about how some of these themes collide in New Haven in the period after World War II, when American architecture and urban planning became a central arena for working out issues related to poverty, race, populism, and hypercharged capitalism. The presentation title, Model City, is a play on words. I'm sure a lot of people today know a little bit about model cities and about urban renewal, and especially New Haven's important role in those things. In the 1950s to 70s, New Haven was seen as a model city by planning, housing, and transportation planners and bureaucrats for how much land was redeveloped. And when I say redeveloped, what I really mean is how many existing homes, buildings, and neighborhoods were bulldozed to make way for modern housing and commercial developments and wider and longer roads as a result of federal and local funding for what was called urban renewal. In the 1950s and 60s, in New Haven, about 7,000 households were displaced as a result of these projects, and an equal number moved themselves when they saw what was coming. One study by a Yale student showed that about 40% of the city's Black population was relocated during this time. At the same time, industrial cities like New Haven were reeling as the mass migration movement that has been called white flight took off, and affluent white families moved to the suburbs, lured by cheap mortgages by the federal government. Once this demographic started to leave, businesses and restaurants started to move with them to malls and new commercial developments that were outside of the city center. So a lot of us know this history, but when we think about it from the perspective of architecture and planning, in a lot of ways, these were great conditions, as it meant more work in the suburbs and more work in the cities due to these migration patterns. So I'm giving you here just a sense of how drastically these population numbers were dropping in New Haven and in cities like New Haven. We have very similar numbers in Providence, which is where I am. So city leaders, seeing these population numbers dropping, began to panic. At this point, 50 years down the road, 50 years after all of this has happened, we've seen the ways in which cities have attempted to capitalize on artists and other creatives, and I mean literally capitalize on artists and the art infrastructure, or to fund what has been called creative placemaking projects that use the arts to re-inhabit and gentrify certain neighborhoods. We're now used to seeing civic leaders use artists and the arts strategically, thinking about the city as though it were a stage, and intractable problems with deep roots in structural racism and inequality as though they could be solved with a new stage set. If cities looked fun today, because this is very much still a sort of a part of urban planning and the way that cities are being planned and developed, then it must mean that life is fun too. The sense that dynamic design could save the city emerged in the 1960s. This is when we see projects like East Harlem Plaza, designed by the landscape architect Albert Mayer in 1962, to make an East Harlem public housing project on 114th Street seem lively and colorful. The press wrote about this particular project, which won many design awards, by the way, when it was completed, that it lent a festival atmosphere and that it was, quote, a place of gaiety and, quote, a model of brightness for the nation to follow. One way to create a slumless city, which I am referring now to the first slide that I showed you that referred to New Haven as hopefully being a slumless city, was to turn public urban space, especially in poor Black neighborhoods, into celebratory places. Or rather, not to necessarily turn them into celebratory places, but to frame them as celebratory places. One person who was explicit about this strategy at the time was Thomas Hoving, who was the Parks Commissioner in New York from 1966 to 67 under Mayor John Lindsay before becoming the director of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Hoving literally referred to the Central Park happenings he masterminded, and I'm showing you there on the bottom right photograph of one of these happenings in Central Park, and also programs that he ran at public housing projects over the summer, and a lot of them. He was actually only Parks Commissioner for less than 2 years, but was incredibly energetic and also had, I think, the relationships to get programs through. So a lot happened under his leadership in those under 2 years. There were the creation of small, what was called best pocket parks, small parks on demolished or empty lots, outdoor movie nights, and a program which has kind of been lost to history, which is really interesting, that brought mobile pools into public housing projects all over New York City. He openly referred to these projects as, quote, bread and circuses. In an interview, he also referred to them as free explosive maintenance, thinking to race riots that were happening in some of the cities across the United States at this point. So architecture, landscape design, and public programs were being used at this point strategically to distract the urban residents who were left in the city from the fact that the deck was stacked. It had been stacked by federal regulations and policies that pulled money out of non-white, poorer neighborhoods via redlining and pushed money into predominantly white, middle-class suburbs via mortgage guarantees. So given this context, it was going to be hard for architecture and urban and park design to revitalize inner cities, given kind of these structural things that are unfolding during this period and before. But local leaders and architects in many cities during the 1960s and 70s tried, and their motives were often mixed. Now to New Haven. There was a political angle for elected officials who then knew, as they know now, that redevelopment projects photograph well and, importantly, can be executed within a single election cycle. I'm showing you here New Haven Mayor Dick Lee's re-election campaign poster from the mid-1960s, and you'll see that every piece of it refers to redevelopment project. He makes the case that new playgrounds are bringing down New Haven's juvenile delinquency rates. The new housing for the elderly is saving them from a life of, quote, despair and, quote, misery. That's the small text that you can't really read there above the photo on the bottom left. And that the new Church Street development, and that's the photograph on the bottom right of the poster, would boost the economy by bringing in business from out of town. This is not actually what got built, and I will get to what actually did get built a little bit later in the presentation. In a letter dated May 28, 1965, Lee wrote to the architect Mies van der Rohe, who was then in discussion with the city about the design of this plot, Church Street South. For people who know Mies van der Rohe's work, this is just sort of amusing, and the gall, I think, too, of Dick Lee at the time. So Lee writes to Mies to ask him for renderings and a model as, quote, this will be very helpful to me in the election. And this is likely the model that you see in this campaign poster at the bottom right. So this is not the first or last time that Mayor Dickley saw political advantage in hiring the best known architect of the day to design city projects on redeveloped land. The first of these projects was Crawford Manor, which I'm not showing you here, but I'll get to in a second, a public housing tower for the elderly that was designed by Paul Rudolph in 1962. So to understand why he wanted Rudolph, we need to look at this building, which I'm sure a lot of people who are here today, if you have been to New Haven, you are very familiar with the Art and Architecture building. And if we were in the British Art Center right now, we would be a block away. And also we would only be about 4 blocks away from Crawford Manor. And so it's too bad that we all can't be together, because it would be such a great opportunity to kind of be together with this presentation and then go and see some of the buildings that we're talking about. This is the Art and Architecture building, and it really cemented Rudolph's reputation as the leading architect of his generation by the early 1960s. Rudolph was the dean of the Yale School of Architecture from 1958 to 1964. And as I said, this is a building that many people feel very, very strongly about. I think increasing numbers feel positively about it and appreciate some of the things that Rudolph was trying to do, especially if you've really been inside of the building. But I think it remains kind of contested building and probably a much hated building also among a pretty wide public in New Haven. Rudolph himself was known as a brutalist architect for his use of concrete. And I just thought it would be interesting to show his work is really in the spotlight these days, as some of his homes sell for record prices and other projects are demolished. And on the left, I'm showing you a home that Rudolph designed in Sarasota, which was on the market for close to $5 million. And on the right, for anyone who's seen it before it was demolished, the Orange County Government Center in New York. That was demolished about 5 years ago. But back to the Art and Architecture building, what made it so special and so groundbreaking at the time, really the kind of way that Rudolph treats space and sort of spatial complexity within the building. In a 1964 interview, he said that that was really his prime consideration in designing the Art and Architecture building. He proudly pointed out that the building had over 30 different levels, and that's why on the right, I'm showing you a section of the building so you can sort of appreciate what's actually happening inside. These 30 different levels range in ceiling height from 7 to 28 feet. These trays of space are laid out in a pinwheel scheme that wraps around the 2 central double height spaces in the building, which you can see, the second floor art gallery and the 4th floor drafting room. When visitors complained of disorientation, Rudolph replied that, quote, the purposely secret circulation system of the building had never been meant for casual visitors, but for the students and faculty who used it every day. Even the cave-like entrance to the building is hard to find. And the left is a modern photograph, actually, because you can see on the right the art history building that has gone up since. But I will tell you that the entrance to the Art and Architecture building is in this photograph and sort of hidden, but you'll get a sense of how difficult it can be for people who don't know it well to even figure out how to get inside. Rudolph was responsible for the interior design as well. It was an unusual combination of mod orange pile rugs, exposed tungsten light bulbs, and primitive cargo netting sunshades. The art objects which he placed throughout the building's interior evoked an archaeological dig. Casts of classical sculpture, Assyrian wall reliefs, ancient candelabra, and a gate from the architect Louis Sullivan's Chicago Stock Exchange contributed to a sense of mangled time inside. The building's rough concrete facade was hammered by hand to expose the colorful aggregate of purple, orange, green, and red stones. And the photograph at right, I actually took the last time I was in New Haven. I partially took it because it's so hard to find photographs that show some of the colors in the stone that's set into the concrete. That sort of gives you a sense, and even that isn't quite true to life. It's a little bit dull. Inside of the building, Rudolph also personally placed large seashells in the basement level and 1st floor walls before the concrete cured. The technique made the building look like a marine ruin, the product of natural forces which coalesced and then began to disintegrate with the passage of time. And I think a lot of people might not agree with this reading and feel like it's maybe too soft or too generous to Rudolph. But I think, if you kind of look really at what he's doing with the concrete and how he is placing these stones and shells inside of it, having the exterior literally hand hammered, it does sort of have the look of a petrified sandcastle to me. The building has been referred to as the building of the 1960s in America. And when it was finished, Rudolph was described as heir to Frank Lloyd Wright. So this is the context in which Mayor Dick Lee commissioned Rudolph to design Crawford Manor, which is only a few blocks away from the Art and Architecture Building. So this is the Crawford Manor site before the neighborhood was raised to make way for the tower and for the nearby Oak Street connector, which is a mega road that was intended to lure people back into the city center from suburbia by providing faster, easier access. As a side note, because as many know who are on this call, Louis Kahn is the architect of the Yale Center for British Art. We'll sort of track Kahn a little bit through this presentation as well. So looking at this photograph, as a side note, Kahn was asked to do design work in this neighborhood before any demolition took place by the New Haven Redevelopment Agency. And he and the agency had a falling out when Kahn proposed that many of the existing homes be kept. He referred to towers like Crawford Manor as, quote, vertical cemeteries. But Rudolph had no such qualms, and he accepted a commission on the site. Unlike the A&A, the Art and Architecture Building, which challenged building users with its incredibly complex spatial organization inside, Crawford Manor was a relatively straightforward building inside. Rudolph instead here was focused on the exterior, which he referred to as a stalk and a landmark. That was a characterization that others picked up on as Mayor Dick Lee and the press referred to it as, quote, a landmark piece of architecture on the city's skyline. That was pretty much repeated in every single article and award that this building won, was sort of its landmark quality on the skyline. A lot of what Rudolph and the press said about the building focused on its exterior. The balconies, which created a dynamic sense of movement, the vertical grooves of the concrete blocks accentuating the tower's upward reach. At a public hearing on the project in 1963, Lee personally attended to voice support for the choice of Rudolph as architect, because there was a little bit of trepidation going with someone so well-known. He might sort of design something that was either too expensive, too complicated, or just too many bells and whistles. When I was doing research on the building, this is a photograph that I found in Mayor Lee's archive, and that archive is actually held at Yale's library. So when I found this, or it's still there in the archive, and this is obviously a photograph of Crawford Manor, it was a huge print, and it was mounted on cardboard, and it was filed with his campaign posters. And this particular photograph was also the one that was used on the building's dedication day. So it was sort of Lee specifically, and also the city's chosen official photograph for Crawford Manor. The building was given a design award by the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and it contributed to Lee's award of a citation from the American Institute of Architects in 1968. Its completion was really regarded as significant in New Haven. Lee had the singer Marian Anderson perform a topping off ceremony in 1965, and the executive director of the NAACP gave a speech on dedication day in 1966. These choices were clearly meant to signal that city government was working for the Black community in New Haven, whom we know were actually displaced to make way for this building. I don't know that the term architecture washing has been used, but I think when people speak about art washing, they refer to the practice of using the arts like murals or art installations to distract or draw attention away from displacement and gentrification. So in a way, to me, what Lee was doing in the 1960s was sort of an early form of this practice, but using architecture rather than public art or installation art to distract from the displacement that was happening to make way for big city development projects like this one. So the next big housing project that appeared to Lee to have the same potential was Church Street South. We saw an earlier design iteration from the mid-1960s when Mies van der Rohe was involved, but what actually ended up taking shape was low to moderate income housing, a little over 700 units, I think in all, designed by Charles Moore. This was not an easy project. It took 32 site plans and agency reviews for the final design to be approved. And in choosing Moore, Lee was following his own precedent. We'll remember that when Rudolph was chosen, he was dean of Yale School of Architecture. When Moore was chosen, he was dean of Yale School of Architecture because he came in after Rudolph and stayed on until 1970. Church Street South was actually completed a little bit after Moore had left. Lee was not happy about this one, and the correspondence about it in his archive is painful. I'm showing you some of the letters here, which I think you can actually read, which are, I think, to our eyes today, both amusing and sort of heartbreaking. I show them to you partially because it's interesting just to see how deep in the weeds Dick Lee was with these architects on these projects and just how invested he was. So on August 4th, he writes to Moore. Here is a letter on the left. My worst fears have been realized. Church Street South does not look like Fort Monmouth or Fort Belvoir. With all apologies for my bluntness, it looks worse. Church Street South is my last venture in housing as I leave office, and very frankly, as I look at it now, it is probably the worst venture, with one of the best and finest and most decent architects I have known. Please, Charles, isn't there something to relieve the monotonous sterility of what you have done? That is an architect to receive that with the U underlined. Had I seen finally what you were planning, I would never have proceeded with your proposal. Or bluntly speaking, I would have chosen another architect. A concrete palace, and palace is not the best word, is emerging from the ground. I feel almost that what was there before was more attractive in a quaint and old-fashioned way than what we are building, except for the fact that we are providing homes there. I feel most depressed about your first major adventure in architecture in the Northeast. My dear chap, I am most unhappy. Dick Lee. On August 13th, Dick Lee gets a response from Moore's office that Moore is on vacation in Finland. So Charles Moore didn't receive this as soon as it went out. And here is how Lee responds to this letter on August 15th, which is the letter on the right. Dear Tom, and Tom is the project architect in Moore's office who's let Dick Lee know that Moore is still on vacation. Dear Tom, no amount of explanation is going to conceal the stark blah, which is Church Street South. I will be glad to listen, but my heart is broken. Sincerely. When Moore returns, he writes to Lee on September 11th. And that's a longer letter, and I'm not going to show you the whole thing, but I will read excerpts of it so you can get a sense of this disagreement between Mayor Lee and Charles Moore about what Church Street South is, what it means, who it's for, and what the goals are of this project. He writes September 11th, 1969, Dear Dick, I have your letter and the subsequent exchange with Tom Rapp, and of course distressed to learn that you have reacted so strongly to the present appearance of Church Street South. I am no more interested than you in excuses, since what we say to each other will in no way affect the eventual public and critical response to the area, which is the chief concern of us both, and even more central to my professional future than to your own. I still have confidence in the eventual success of Church Street South, even though I see there now the same bleak concrete block walls that you see. The real design importance of the area will lie in the way the public infrastructure, reduced to an intimate scale, is overlaid upon the site to confer importance and specialness on a set of bland, you say blah, and neutral buildings. It will confer the same dignity and importance on the architecturally silent dwellings. He goes on to say some other things, but I'm reading it to you to sort of, it's interesting that he chooses to characterize them as architecturally silent. He talks a little bit then about how he thinks some of the future things that will happen are really going to change the entire look and feel of Church Street South, including the pigmented waterproofing stain, the application of color and pattern to the front porches, and the public web, which in Church Street South is the visual as well as functional key to the project's success. The very last sentence, I can only hope that your present dismay will turn to pride. I'll work very hard to bring about that moment. Sincerely, Charles. Okay, so that is their exchange. And then, sort of going back to Church Street South itself, the issue for Lee was the look of the concrete block. Moore had intended the project's home to be made of cast concrete, which would have given it a softer, more crafty appearance. But the developer didn't calculate costs correctly, and using concrete block saved $800,000, so they had to go with the concrete block. There were other late stage changes that Moore was unhappy with. The stairways and railings were to have been wood, and the ends of the facades were to have been brick to give each home more of an individual look. When Lee in his letter referred to Fort Monmouth and Fort Belvoir, he was comparing Church Street South, for those who don't know what they are, to an army barrack. And as you saw from the letter, that part of the reason he was so unhappy about this is that it is, quote, his last venture in housing as I leave office. So in many ways, this was a real political legacy project for Lee. But what you saw happening in the letters is more countering to Lee, acknowledging the bleak concrete walls that are going up, but choosing instead to call them bland and neutral and architecturally silent dwellings. The magic, he insists, is going to lie in the public space throughout the project, which these photographs show were really considered in the design. Moore was part of a new generation in architecture in the mid-1960s that were turning their back on modernism and looking for inspiration to ancient and medieval villages. He did a master's and a PhD in architecture at Princeton, and his thesis was on urban planning in Monterey, California, which suggested that the plan for Monterey should really respect the historic adobe dwellings. And as a side note, since we continue to track Kahn through this, Moore was Kahn's teaching assistant when Kahn taught briefly at Princeton, so he comes into play there as well. But what this meant for Church Street South is that Moore was really focused on the project's social spaces as places to congregate and build community. He tried desperately to find ways to make this place more of a village, naming the streets that ran through the development. You can see actually on the bottom, second from left there, that's one of the street names that were in Church Street South. And using paint and super graphics to call attention to the commercial strip and to individualize each townhouse. Some of these moves were made by other architects who were faced with the challenge of creating homes out of low-income housing projects. At left, I'm showing you a photograph of Easter Hill Village in Richmond, California, designed in the early 1950s by Don Hardison and Vernon DeMars. And actually, well, you can see the rocks in the foreground there. For those who follow landscape architecture, Lawrence Halpern was involved as landscape architect on that project. And then on the right, I'm showing you a photograph of Bertrand Goldberg Hilliard Homes in Chicago from the early 1960s. The plan was very focused on outdoor space, recreational space. This is an amphitheater that was part of that project. So just showing you a little bit of context, some similar moves that architects had been making in the previous decade, specifically in public housing and lower income housing projects. In an interview with Newsweek, Moore said, "The individual house is a labor of love. I've done government-sponsored low-income housing work, and it's like working in the dark." And here, clearly, he's talking about Church Street South. "I don't know who the people living there will be." So Church Street South was more engaged in sort of a labor of love for an unspecified client. You can see the care that went into the design in these photographs. And I should say, for those who don't know, that these photographs and others are all that we have because Church Street South was demolished several years ago. What I think is so interesting about this kind of conversation and negotiation that happens between Lee and Moore on Church Street South is that the same building or cultural landscape can often have different meanings for different people. So we've seen how Lee used architecture strategically to burnish his political image. To Lee, and he's not the only one because this is a really common theme in urban development projects, one of the chief concerns was how Crawford Manor and Church Street South looked to those on the outside, whether to passersby, in cars or on foot, or in photographs. Lee was not concerned in his letters with how the units in Church Street South might feel to residents. He was really concerned with their appearance to outsiders. Moore had a more nuanced approach. He was interested in how it would feel to live in Church Street South. Like Rudolph, who designed the art and architecture building for the students and faculty who would use it every day, Moore designed Church Street South for the residents. And there was also a political angle to his design. In 1966 essay, written at the start of his time at Yale while he was deep in the design of Church Street South, Moore wrote about what he called the public realm. He wrote about the challenges of combating what he called placelessness in modern America, the ways in which capitalist culture was homogenizing place, bulldozing individual identity of places, neighborhoods, and said that we need plazas and other large undefined spaces to foment, quote, an effective revolution of the Latin American sort. So this was partly tongue-in-cheek, but partly not. Moore tried to name one of Church Street South streets for Malcolm X, but city authorities would change this to Malcolm Court. For all of this attention, it was not actually successful from the point of view of many of the residents, which was partly why it was demolished. So wrapping up here, this story I think has relevance today for a few reasons. Today, as in the 1960s and early 1970s, we're in a period of radical cultural and political change, which now as then has to do with racial injustice and inequity. Now is then the question of how architecture, public art, and the design of public space participates in or mitigates against change is on the table. I don't think it's an accident that many of the actions undertaken in support of the movement for Black lives over the last 9 months have taken place at Confederate statues. To achieve social justice, we must have spatial justice. Many of the leading architects of the 1960s and 70s, like Moore, were engaged in this struggle. Their designs were not always successful, but many of them tried to literally help build a better world through architecture. Here I'm thinking about architects like Bertrand Goldberg, Stanley Tigerman, Jan Wampler, and landscape architects like M. Paul Friedberg. Many of these are not as well known as they should be, but their work is really interesting for a variety of reasons, and one, sort of their deep engagement with social issues and issues of social justice. Over the last year or so, to close, I've been wondering, where are the architects today? We are living through a time of national reckoning that raises questions about race, equity, and inclusion. All of these issues have ramifications for architecture and design. I'm not sure why it is, and maybe I'm wrong. And actually, if there are architects who are in the audience who have something to add, I'd love to hear that too in just a second. But it feels to me like I'm not seeing the same level of engagement with these issues now as we saw 50 years ago. To me, this raises a fundamental question, which is this: what do we want from architecture? Do we want pretty or interesting buildings? Do we want a dynamic stage set or a dynamic Instagram backdrop? Or do we want carefully conceived and strategic physical and social interventions into our landscape? Interventions that are intended to expand the field of spatial justice. One problem, of course, is clients, because the clients who pay the architect often side with the status quo. But maybe at this point, we need a new kind of model city. Thanks.
Fantastic. Really wonderful, wonderful lecture, Marisa. Thank you very, very much. I wondered if you could tell us, the name of your lecture, of course, is Model City. Could you tell us a little bit about the Model Cities program that was started under President Johnson and what that hoped to achieve?
Yeah, I mean, the period that I'm talking about here, which I really think is one of the most interesting periods for people who are interested in architecture, landscape architecture, and planning, being the 50s, 60s, and early 70s. So the Model Cities program followed on urban renewal, and I'm sure a lot of people who are with us today know a lot about urban renewal and sort of what was happening in the 1950s with demolition of neighborhoods to make way for highways and modern housing and commercial developments. And then the Model Cities program was an attempt to bring communities a little more centrally into planning, to not have the focus be on demolition, to think about ways to save existing neighborhoods, to preserve them, to get community input, and to not put such a focus on new architecture, especially as a way to solve some of these problems that went much deeper, of course, than design. To me, what's so interesting about a city like New Haven is There's always the federal policy on the one hand, but then it's sort of what happens on the ground in places. And New Haven is an especially interesting example, partially because Mayor Lee had a lot of power. He was mayor for a very long time, for 16 years, and was really interested in architecture and had access because of Yale School of Architecture. So there's a lot that's happening in the mix in a small place in New Haven, which makes it such an interesting case study for this period.
Mm-hmm. Can you tell us what is now taking the place of Church Street South, that the Moore project is no longer there? What is going on with that site?
I'm actually not exactly sure what is happening with the site. The last time I was in New Haven, I went down there, but I have not actually kept up too much with what's going on. You probably know better than I do. Do you know what's happening on the site right now?
I have not really sort of followed that very, very closely. I know there's
Yeah,
some things being constructed now, but
yeah,
I've not had a chance to sort of follow it very closely.
yeah.
We have a question about Robert Moses. Was he involved during this period in New Haven? He's a native of New Haven.
Not that I know of. Lee and Moses would have known each other. Lee was really recognized along with a couple of other mayors like Logue and, John Lindsay did a lot of work. He was mayor for a short time in New York City, but was really interested too in architecture specifically, but had his hands in a lot of development projects. They would have known each other, but I don't know too much about the personal relationship that they would have had at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's a good question though.
What kind of documentation? We have another question about Church Street South, which is why did the residents find it so lacking as a place to live? What was it about it that they reacted to?
Well, again, it's always an interesting case when architects often get blamed for problems that are not the design alone. And I think some of the problems that people had with Church Street South related to not necessarily the design, but I think people just did not like the concrete block. And a lot of the stuff that Lee was saying in those letters about a concrete palace resembling an army barracks, I think people felt they didn't want to live in a housing development that was all concrete, that despite Moore's attempts to, use paint and really focus on the public social spaces, that just didn't go far enough at all. And the reality was that people didn't like it, and there were leaks. There were all kinds of structural problems over time. But, I think how much of that blame should fall on Moore's shoulders, and especially with the challenge of designing public or low-income housing that is not maintained properly over its life, and where the resources that are needed have not been put into projects like this. It's sort of hard to parse out if residents are unhappy living in those projects, what percent is that due to the design and what percent just to issues of maintenance and much deeper structural problems that we recognize.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you offhand have an example of public housing that you think has been particularly successful, not just in New Haven, but anywhere?
That's a good question. I mean, I think, yes, but in some ways, I think that what most cities now, the very top of the list for problems, certainly in Providence, and I'm sure New Haven is the same now, is a real lack of affordable housing. And what happened in the 1960s and 70s, which is something I've worked a lot on in public housing design, there was a lot of money, comparatively in America anyway, a lot of money for those years. And all of that money really dried up in the early 1970s because we switched to a policy angle that subsidizes housing rather than provides public housing. We just don't have a lot anymore. A lot of what's happening in, say, New York City, cities that have so many units of public housing, is that they're going back and renovating some of the projects that were built in the 40s and 50s that were deeply unpopular for a long time, but they're kind of turning back to renovate now. But one thing that's really always interested me is sort of this 15-year period where architects in America and landscape architects really got involved in the design of public housing. And a lot of these projects were not successful, but what has been interesting to me was their attempt to design public housing specifically for those residents.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
We have a question about Dick Lee's legacy. Could you reflect on that personally, whether you believe he was a successful man. I mean, he was a very young mayor, and he was sort of held up in the United States as one of the preeminent young mayors that was really making a big impact on the city. What have you learned through looking through his archive and your research about his legacy and also the way he saw his legacy himself?
Yeah. Well, I'm actually curious, Mike, what are your thoughts on that? And you've also been writing about New Haven for long enough that in some
Yeah.
ways, when you're doing it for long enough, it's interesting to see the way people's perception of someone like Lee will change over time.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting. I think that Lee, apparently, there was an interview with Lee done in the late 1990s. And he was just ironic about the Oak Street connector being like the shortest highway in the United States. And he sort of just laughed and said, yeah, that's my legacy. It's the shortest highway in the United States. Oak Street connector obviously was a terrible slash in the city that obliterated neighborhoods that were there.
Yeah.
And Dick Lee was listening to a lot of experts. He was listening to a lot of people involved in planning and architecture circles. And he was maybe, in a way, relying on them. I mean, as that correspondence between Charles Moore and Dick Lee shows, he was really counting on Moore to bring something to New Haven, which was unique and could be a positive thing in people's lives. But that's not the way Lee perceived it. You didn't have to be an architecture critic to figure that out.
Yeah. I think some of the other correspondence that's so interesting in his archive is sort of this question of being so deeply in the weeds. There are many letters that he writes to managers of various housing projects in New Haven that are super specific. Like, I drove by yesterday and I noticed that some of the flowers lining the parking lot look a little worse for the wear. Can't we please replace those with, and he would list flowers that he thought should be replaced.
Wow.
So he was just, every couple of generations has mayors like that are incredibly invested on a personal level with everything that's happening. I don't know, it's interesting. When I started looking at the Lee material and all of this was maybe 20 years ago. And, I think we were in a really different place. I think New Haven got held up as sort of the worst excesses of urban renewal. And a lot of cities like Providence, for example, I think got away with a reputation for being much more preservation minded and not caving to urban renewal and tearing whole neighborhoods down. But we know now many of those cities did it. They just did it a little bit less flashily. And so when the tide turned and public opinion really turned against a lot of that redevelopment, a lot of cities got away with profiles that I'm not sure that they really deserved. And I think New Haven probably got bashed a little bit much.
Mm-hmm. We have a question here from a participant who wanted to know what you think preservation and planning of today, how that will be viewed in 50 years. Here we are today, reflecting on 50 years ago, what was happening. What do you think the assessment might be for preservation and taking care of the fabric of our cities today?
I love that question. 50 years from now, too. I mean, also, I don't know if we all mentally even want to go to that place right now in terms of thinking about cities and sea level rise and climate change. And this is something I've really been focusing on recently, is where the field of preservation is right now and what challenges it is either grappling with or in some ways not grappling with quite enough. I mean, I think we're in a place with preservation and with architecture and architectural history where we recognize the deep structural racism of these fields, the fact that the buildings and spaces, whether we Americans or we preservationists have worked hardest to preserve, tend to preserve a very small slice of who makes up this country and who lives in this country. And so the whole field is partially grappling with that and at the same time not quite doing enough across the board to grapple with it. There are a lot of bright spots. The National Trust for Historic Preservation started a new African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund, which is funding a lot of really important work. Preservation organizations that exist across the country, nonprofits, I think are starting to grapple with their own histories and which neighborhoods they have focused their attention on, which neighborhoods they have ignored. Like I said in the beginning, I think we're all starting to think a little bit more about demolished neighborhoods, places we've lost. Are there ways to get back these neighborhoods, even if we can't get the fabric back? Are there ways to create public art, public history projects that bring them back into the story of local cities and kind of the larger story of America? But it's a great question. I think the field of preservation is under a lot of stress right now, a lot of challenges. I see a lot of bright spots, but I think some of these things need to be speeded up in the way that the field is responding to them.
Could you also comment? We know that you're interested in spatial justice, which is, I think, an interesting term. Can you talk a bit about what spatial justice contributes to living and working in the city, being a place?
I brought it in at the end sort of as an alternative way to think about cities, which I think is the right way. But I also wanted to really show how different it is as a way to think about cities and architecture from the 1960s, where what we're seeing is a lot of focus on the look of architecture. Kind of architecture is, like I said, a stage set, or the city is a stage set. So
watching, which I think is a great term.
I mean, even more, you'd want to go into the context of the rise of the media during that time, and, you know, television and film and visual culture and architecture being very much caught up in all of that and being really perceived as sort of a visual field. Spatial, yes, and we're looking at Paul Rudolph, but also highly visual. So I think this focus on spatial justice, to me, is really important because it gets to how people experience cities and places. And we know that that is, of course, more important in a way than how these places look in photographs or on campaign posters.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Great. Well, we have run out of time. It's 1:00. Thank you very, very much for a fantastic lecture. But before we say goodbye, I wanted to remind everybody that on April 9th, the Yale Center for British Art will have another lecture featuring the artist On Millet at 12 noon, same spot here. So thank you again, and thank you all for participating and being here today. And Marisa, thank you again for an excellent lecture and a wonderful discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. We didn't get into your memories of Charles Moore and Paul Rudolph. The audience missed out.
Okay. This is your day.
On chapter 2, you'll have to share those anecdotes. All right.
Okay, thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks.